Hi, it's Katrina. Battle of Grunwald. In the year 1190, the Order of Teutonic Knights was created in the Holy Land of Jerusalem. They were moved into Eastern Europe with support of the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy. In the 1230s, these knights set forth to capture Prussia and convert the pagan population there to Christianity. The Teutonic Knights cut Poland off from the Baltic Sea, and by 1346 were in total control of most of the Baltic coast. To the west was Poland and Lithuania, where the populations were already Roman Catholics. This meant the Teutonic Knights had no real justification for being in the area anymore. Everybody was already Roman Catholic. In 1410, an army of Polish and Lithuanian forces invaded and marched on the Teutonic Knights' stronghold. It was a surprise move, and the two armies met near the village of Grunwald. What happened at the battle is a little vague. What we know from historical accounts is that the Teutonic Knights were seriously outnumbered. The opposing army had both heavy cavalry and light cavalry, and were joined by a group of Tatar skirmishers commanded by the former Khan of the Mongolian Golden Horde. After a few hours of fierce fighting, the Teutonic Knights were broken. Those that remained fled into the woods while others retreated to the village, and in the end, they were defeated. This was a historically important battle because it marked the end of the Order of the Teutonic Knights as a military power. It also set up the Polish to become one of the main forces in medieval Europe. The Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium was fought off the western coast of Greece between the Roman leader Octavian and the forces of Mark Antony and Cleopatra of Egypt. It was a major defeat for Mark Antony and Cleopatra, and they would end up dead the following year. But it's how the battle started that's really fascinating. It all began with the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC. This threw Rome into civil war, and the empire split into factions. One faction was ruled by Octavian, the great-nephew of Caesar. Mark Antony took over another faction, and the Roman statesman Lepidus headed the third. Mark Antony controlled the eastern provinces and aligned himself with Cleopatra, who had been ruling Egypt for the previous 7 years. Cleopatra and Antony became romantically involved. They spent a year together in Alexandria, and then in 40 BC, Mark Antony returned to Rome. He married Octavian's sister in an attempt to mend their relationship, but it didn't work. When Antony returned to meet Cleopatra in Syria in 37 BC, he found that she had given birth to twins. The two were married. Mark Antony's military campaign in Parthia was a total failure, and Rome continued to fracture. In the year 31, Octavian declared war. The two opposing forces met off the coast of Greece and engaged in battle, but after heavy fighting, things were looking grim for Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Cleopatra actually bailed halfway through the battle and took 60 of her ships back to Egypt. Antony managed to break through enemy lines and follow her. They were beaten, though, and the remaining soldiers surrendered to Octavian. About a year later, Octavian finally reached the city of Alexandria and once again defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. To escape being captured, Cleopatra took her own life, and Mark Antony impaled himself on his sword. The Gallic Wars. The Gallic Wars happened in the years before the Roman Emperor Julius Caesar was killed. The Roman general had decided he was going to completely eradicate the people of Gaul, which was once a region in modern-day France. The Gauls were assisted by other tribes trying to defend their homelands against the aggressive Romans, including the Germanic and the Brythonic tribes. Battles were waged for 8 long years between 58 and 50 BC, but the major fight was that of the Battle of Alesia in the year 52 BC. The Romans smashed the tribal forces, resulting in the expansion of the Roman Republic. The Romans took over the entire region of Gaul. Historical records show that even though the Romans shouldn't have technically been a match for the brutal and fearless fighters of the Gauls, it was the tribe's internal divisions that led to their defeat. The Gallic chieftain Vercingetorix had attempted to unite them all under a single banner, but it was too little, too late. Caesar absolutely destroyed their forces in 52 BC. What followed was 2 years of very little resistance. The Romans continued marching into their lands and taking the Gauls as slaves. The campaign cemented Julius Caesar in history as one of the most legendary commanders ever. Less than a decade later, he would be dead. The Battle of Agincourt. The Battle of Agincourt was fought during the 100 Years' War between England and France. Henry V was the young King of England on October 25, 1415, when he led his forces to Agincourt in the north of France and absolutely decimated the enemy. But the campaign was a long and bloody one. 2 months before the epic battle, Henry had crossed from England to France with 11,000 soldiers. He laid siege to the city of Harfleur in Normandy, which lasted 5 weeks. After Harfleur surrendered, Henry had lost a significant amount of his men to disease. He needed to march his remaining army to Calais to meet the English fleet and return to England. But there was a huge army of 20,000 French soldiers stationed at Agincourt, directly in his path. They outnumbered his exhausted army over 3-1. Nonetheless, Henry would go to battle. He led his men to the battlefield, which was a space of open ground hemmed on either side by thick woods. What this meant was that the French couldn't outmaneuver the English because the woods were in the way. Plus, the French knights were all weighed down by heavy armor. They were too slow to cross the muddy battlefield. The English met them head-on with a furious bombardment. There was artillery, archers, and longbows raining down on the French at 250 yards away. In the end, even though the French had far more soldiers, the English archers and artillery destroyed them in battle. They could barely reach the English position with all the arrows raining down on their heads. The French started with 20,000 men, and the English with much fewer. At the end of the battle, 6,000 French were dead, and only 400 English had been killed. It was one of the greatest victories in military history. Shortly after, in the year 1420, Henry V was recognized as the heir to the French throne. Spartas 300. The Battle of Thermopylae was fought in the year 480 BC between Leonidas of Sparta and Xerxes of Persia. Just like the movie 300, Leonidas led his 300 Spartans against the entire Persian army. The Persians had been marching on Greece with the biggest army the world had ever seen. Their giant force rolled through the country unopposed, and every city cowered before them. But before they could reach central Greece, the Spartan king took a small host of his best warriors and met the Persian army at the pass of Thermopylae. This battle would go down in history as a legendary last stand. But here's what you didn't see in the movie. In the beginning, the Spartans were joined by 7,000 Greek warriors. That means it was 7,300 versus the Persian army, which numbered about 200,000. The odds weren't in their favor, but the narrow pass meant Xerxes couldn't maneuver around them. There was no choice but to meet head-on in tight, close-quarters combat. For 2 days, the Greeks and Spartans beat back the Persians unaffected. Even the 10,000 Persian immortals were mostly slaughtered when they tried to get through the pass. But everything came undone on the 3rd day when Xerxes learned of a way around the pass. The Greeks and Spartans learned that they were about to be caught in a trap, and most of the Greeks went home. But the Spartans did not, and neither did a small contingent of 700 warriors from Thespiae. These men stayed, knowing that all of Xerxes' power was about to come crashing down upon them, and they fought until every last one of them was dead. The Battle of Towton. Ask any historian what the biggest and bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil was, and many will cite the Battle of Towton. This massive action was fought on March 29, 1461. And was the most savage battle fought in Great Britain. To understand what happened, we need to look at the monarchy. King Henry VI had transferred the right of succession to Richard, Duke of York, but Queen Margaret was unwilling to allow her son, and Henry VI's son, to be passed over like that. England suddenly had 2 kings, and the only way to settle which was the rightful ruler was on the battlefield. The battle was fought between the supporters of Queen Margaret and the supporters of the Duke of York. You can also think of it as the House of York versus the House of Lancaster. 50,000 soldiers met outside the village of Towton and fought for hours during a snowstorm. The Yorkists, or the supporters of Richard, won the battle and cut down their enemies as they tried to flee. Even after they had surrendered, they were butchered. The end of the day saw about 28,000 dead in the snow. The slaughter at Camulodunum. Camulodunum was the first capital of the Roman Empire in Britain. It was also the site of an epic battle between rebels and Roman occupiers. I say battle, but kind of mean slaughter. The occupied Britons had been suppressed for too long under the Roman invaders, and they snapped. Unfortunately for the Romans, they had become so complacent that they downgraded Camulodunum from a powerful fortress into an ordinary city. It wasn't ready for when the rebels exploded from the inside and systematically butchered every last Roman they could find. This wasn't something that happened by surprise. As a Roman-occupied town, the native Britons were being taxed unfairly. There was famine, unrest, and the locals were forced to fight in the Roman army even though they hated them. The Romans continued to occupy and kept seizing their lands, breeding resentment and rebellion. In the year 60 AD, after her daughters were assaulted by Roman soldiers and her land seized, the rebel leader Boudica gathered an army of 10,000 angry Britons, and they marched on Camulodunum. No one in the city was prepared for what happened. It was razed to the ground, the townspeople were killed, and then they turned on the next city, Londinium. According to Historic UK, by the time the rebellion had fizzled out, roughly 70,000 people were dead. Are you familiar with the story of the warrior Queen Boudica? Let me know in the comments. Battle of Gaugamela. The Battle of Gaugamela commenced on October 1st, 331 BC. Alexander the Great had just beaten the Persians 2 years prior at Issus, and now needed to secure his hold on Syria. It was time for him to topple the Persian Empire once and for all. He crossed the Euphrates and Tigris rivers in 331 and was met by the very last army of Darius III. Darius had scraped together every great beast, warrior, and every able-bodied man to stop the relentless march of the Macedonians. But it wasn't enough. Alexander was far too clever. He advanced within just 4 miles of the Persians and then made camp. Darius had anticipated a nighttime assault and kept his soldiers awake and waiting. But Alexander let his men sleep through the night, so they were rested for the real attack the next morning. The fighting was absolutely brutal. Historians estimate that the Macedonians lost about 4,000 men, while the Persians lost 47,000. Alexander the Great decimated Darius beyond what anyone had thought possible. Darius ran away, leaving the Persian army in ruins. Alexander then moved south and captured Babylon, Susa, and finally the Persian capital, Persepolis. The Battle of Cajamarca. The Battle of Cajamarca was fought between the Inca ruler Atahualpa and a Spanish force led by Francisco Pizarro in November of 1532. The Spanish forces ambushed Atahualpa and his entourage of nobles in the plaza of Cajamarca, swiftly killing thousands. It marked the beginning of the Spanish conquest over the entire Inca civilization. The confrontation, which ended in Atahualpa being captured and the majority of his people slaughtered, started several months earlier. The Spanish and Inca at Gahamarga had been trying to navigate through very tough diplomacy. In the beginning, the Inca didn't think the Spanish were really a threat. Atahualpa had brought Pizarro and his men deep into the heart of the empire where they shouldn't have been able to hurt them. They were surrounded on all sides by fierce Inca warriors. Plus, the Spanish force was only about 150 men strong. Pizarro invited Atahualpa to Cajamarca with plans of taking him out and thereby throwing his army into disarray. It worked. The Inca ruler brought 80,000 men against Pizarro's 150, but Pizarro had managed to get his men garrisoned in the central plaza. They first captured Atahualpa, and then they opened fire on his army. The Inca were so confused and frightened by the gunfire and the bodies of their comrades falling everywhere they looked, they ran for the hills. What should have been an easy victory for the Inca was the beginning of the end. The Battle of Zama. The Second Punic War fought between Rome and Carthage had its great finale at the Battle of Zama. The war had already been going on for 16 years between the forces of Carthage under the ruler of Hannibal and the Romans under Publius Cornelius Scipio. The Romans were determined to destroy Carthage, located in what is today Tunisia, and eliminate them as a rival. They were a huge threat to the empire and had to go. The Battle of Zama saw Carthage fall apart in a profound way. It was so devastating to the Carthaginians that they were no longer even considered a threat to Rome after it. Carthage lost its status as a major power in the Mediterranean, and in the years that followed during the Third Punic War, the Romans easily took the territory for themselves. The battle took place in the year 202 BC. From what we know, based on Greek historians' accounts of the fighting, Hannibal had his army camped at the city of Zama. He had 36,000 infantry and about 80 war elephants. It was the war elephants who opened up the battle by charging at the much fewer 29,000 Roman soldiers, but the Romans had been prepared. It was fairly easy for them to avoid the elephants and scare them away. At that point, the Roman soldiers flowed through Hannibal's men like a wave and destroyed them. The Carthaginians lost around 25,000 men, while the Romans lost only 4,000. The Carthaginians had no choice but to sue for peace. The peace would last for 50 years before the Romans came back to finish what they started. Giant ancient bowl. Here's something you've probably never heard of before. In October of 1966, archaeologists with the Regional Museum of Ica in Peru uncovered an incredibly massive container that looked like a giant egg. Larger than a person, it turned out to be an enormous clay vessel meant to hold grains 2,400 years ago. The bowl measured about 6 feet wide in diameter and was just over 9 feet tall. Inside the giant vessel, archaeologists found a variety of seeds, from beans, yucca, and guava. But here's where things get a little strange. Making a container that big thousands of years ago couldn't have been easy. It's not even easy now. The giant clay pot would have had to be made in a pretty advanced workshop. Archaeologists haven't found any such place in the general area. They believe the giant clay pot was transported from far away. But how? And why? The clay pot was found in the Ica region of Peru, close to the Nazca lines and the Paracas skulls. But even with all of this information, scientists still don't know exactly which culture was responsible for making such a giant pot. For that matter, archaeologists aren't even sure why it was so enormous. Someone definitely used it to store food, but why did they need something so big? It's much more practical to store food in smaller containers that can be filled and moved more easily. The only theory researchers have is that the ancient Peruvians believed that by filling the giant clay vessel with enough food and burying it underground, it could preserve more food for longer. Remember, these people were much more knowledgeable and advanced than we give them credit for. Water on Mars. Astronomers have made a very strange discovery on the red planet. Observations have led to the suggestion that liquid water was flowing on Mars as recently as 2 billion years ago. That was before life on Earth began, but still fairly recent in the galactic timeline of the universe. Scientists use data from NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter to identify chloride salt deposits left behind by flowing water. After studying dozens of images of these salt deposits, scientists were able to date when they were made. Instead of water being on Mars 3 billion years ago, now it was still flowing 2 billion years ago. What makes this so mysterious is that if water had been flowing for so long on the surface of the planet, it could easily have hosted life for much of its geological history. That said, we still don't know what kind of life may have been living on Mars, just when exactly that life went extinct, or where we're going to find proof of it. The good news is that it now appears water was present for long enough on the planet's surface to potentially have spawned some form of life. Scientists still believe there is an underground reservoir beneath the surface of the South Pole, where liquid water could still be trapped. Mysterious ancient geometry tablet. The oldest known example of applied geometry is a clay tablet that dates back to 3,700 years ago. It was created in Babylon and is the only example we have today of a cadastral document. That's a fancy term for a land survey map, once used to define property lines. In other words, someone in old Babylon used geometry in the real world to mark the boundaries of a certain piece of property. The tablet shows highly advanced knowledge of right angles and triangles, a knowledge that wasn't seen again for over 1,000 years. Not until the Greek mathematician Pythagoras came up with his famous theorem, the one we still learn in high school today. The clay tablet is called Psi 427. The mystery behind it is that archaeologists don't know how the ancient Babylonian civilization became so mathematically sophisticated. It shows they obviously had a deep understanding of trigonometry, and yet this knowledge appears to have been lost with them until the Greeks learned it themselves much later. Where did they get the knowledge, and why wasn't it passed on to other civilizations after the fall of Babylon? A wolfish mutation. Scientists have recently discovered a rare mutation in wolves from over 50,000 years ago. This mutation can be found today in very small-sized dogs like Chihuahuas and Pomeranians. Whereas most people believe humans are solely responsible for breeding miniature canines, that's actually not the case. The mutation behind incredibly tiny dogs goes back way before humans ever started breeding anything. The mutation was found in the growth factor 1 gene as part of a study done by the National Institutes of Health Dog Genome Project. The gene was found in tiny dogs alive today, as well as from fossils of Siberian wolves that lived 54,000 years ago. In fact, the gene can be found in every canid species living today. This includes coyotes, jackals, and domesticated dogs. Elaine Ostrander, a geneticist working on the project, said it's as if nature kept the gene tucked away in her back pocket until humans started utilizing it. In other words, the gene was always there to turn giant wolves into tiny chihuahuas, but humans began playing around with breeding and were the ones to unlock it. Mysterious Celtic sword. While surveying the site of an ancient Celtic village near the town of Krudim in East Bohemia, archaeologists stumbled upon a small trove of mysterious artifacts. Included among the artifacts was a sword dating back to the 2nd century BC. It's 2,000 years old, likely once wielded by a Celtic warrior of some renown. Almost as fascinating as the sword is just how the unexpected discovery was made. According to archaeologist David Vitch, the field in which they uncovered the treasure had recently been plowed. This created a unique opportunity to scan the entire field with metal detectors and easily pull out any iron artifacts. It almost seems like just beneath the surface of almost every field in Europe is some ancient trove of treasure waiting to be discovered. Aside from the sword, they also found arrow spikes and pieces of buckles. The sword was almost definitely fashioned by an early Celtic blacksmith. It's sharp on both sides for slashing left and right. Its tip is blunt and there is a rib in the middle of the blade. The handle of the sword was most likely made from leather, but has already decayed. The sword is in pretty rough shape, bent in form and curved. When it was first made, however, it would have been a truly remarkable weapon. As for why it was found in the field, that's a bit of a mystery. The Celts did start out by burying their dead with grave goods to help prepare them for the afterlife. But in the later years, when this sword was used, the Celts had started burning their dead. There is a huge gap in the archaeological record because the Celts simply burned everything and left no trace behind. This sword may have been lost, or even left behind after a great battle. Beaver throwing darts. Scientists with the Canadian Conservation Institute recently discovered a throwing dart 6,000 years old. But stranger than that is that it was made from beaver secretion. It's the earliest use ever documented of humans using castoreum in the making of a weapon. Castoreum is a product that only comes from the anal sac of beavers. The dart, known as an ancient atlatl, was found near Alligator Lake in the Yukon, which is near the border of Canada and Alaska. It was found in the melting alpine ice, where two groups of indigenous people once lived, the Carcross Tagish and the Kwanlin Dun. These ancient people were mainly hunters who stayed in the region because of the abundance of caribou and sheep. In recent years, as the ice has continued to melt, more and more interesting indigenous artifacts have been found, from tools to weapons. The dart is a lot bigger than you probably think. It was almost 7 feet long, made out of birch wood. At one end was a point fixed to the wood with sinew wrappings. The other end was adorned with feathers. The ancient indigenous people would have used it for hunting big game. As for the beaver secretion, it was used as an adhesive to keep all of the different pieces in place. It was basically used as super glue to keep the point, the feathers, and the 3 sections of the dart strong and sturdy. The real mystery here is how in the world the indigenous people figured out that by milking the anal gland of a beaver, they could get an adhesive. The discovery process must have been extremely bizarre. Lost Oxford College. New excavations in Oxford have unveiled the site of a mysterious lost college from medieval days that hasn't been seen since the middle of the 16th century. It's called St. Mary's College, and it was originally founded in 1435. However, within just 100 years, it had fallen into a state of disrepair and was unusable. It then vanished from all historical records and was assumed destroyed. Only now, the college limestone foundations have been found by a research team from Oxford Archaeology. The foundations were found near Oxford city centre, a place that's been occupied continuously since the 11th century. But how did colleges work in the 1400s? St. Mary's was built around the same time as the Lincoln and Magdalen colleges, all of them strange combinations of learning houses and religious buildings. College learning was reserved for those who were devout as well. Construction on St. Mary's was slow. It wasn't until the early part of the 16th century that it received enough funding to become a true college. By the 1530s, it had a 2-story library, a chapel, and its own college kitchens. Shortly after 1535, the college was closed. 5 years later, it had fallen into ruin and was plundered for building materials. It was around this time that the college vanished from the records. Archaeologists believe it was taken apart, and its salvaged pieces used in the building of a nearby church tower. 600 years later, its ruins were found by archaeologists who excavated the site prior to the construction of student housing for Brasenose College. Even after all of these centuries, this site is still a place for education. Ancient figurine. In Germany, a truck driver found a bronze statuette at the bottom of the Tolense River in 2020. It's one of only 13 bronze statuettes found in the region since 1840. Archaeologists believe it may have been part of an early weight system used by Scandinavians thousands of years ago. Either that, or it was a mysterious object of worship, perhaps depicting an unknown deity. Archaeologists aren't sure exactly what it was. By far, the strangest part of the whole thing is that the artifact was discovered by a truck driver. He was snorkeling during some time off in the marshy streams of the river when he made the discovery. He pulled the bronze figurine, about 6 inches tall, out of the muddy peat. The statuette has a head shaped like an egg, looped arms, and a really long nose. It's also depicted with a belt and a neck ring. Thomas Terberger from the Lower Saxony State Office says the artifact is an archaeological riddle. No one knows what it was, how it got into the river, or what it was used for. But this hasn't been the only remarkable thing to come out of the swamp. There have been the skeletons of horses found, military artifacts, and the remains of over 140 people who all died from blunt force trauma. Every single one of these mysterious finds has been traced to roughly 1250 BC. The suggestion is that something very violent happened here in a single day. Archaeologists don't know what happened, nor who was involved, but they do agree this is probably the oldest battle site in all of Europe. Ancient turkey blanket. The great ancestors of the Pueblo Indians, including the Hopi, Rio Grande Pueblos, and the Zuni, made some remarkably comfortable blankets. Archaeologists recently discovered a blanket made from around 11,000 turkey feathers in the American Southwest. The team from Washington State University analyzed the blanket and determined it to be over 800 years old. Still curious, they analyzed it even further to see just how it was made in the first place. What they discovered was that thousands of body feathers from turkeys were wrapped around 200 yards of yucca fiber cord to make the blanket. It took the feathers from between 4 and 10 turkeys to accomplish this. But what's even more interesting is that the ancient Puebloans didn't have to kill any animals to make the thousands of turkey blankets that would have been in circulation. The researchers found that they had probably harvested the feathers when the birds were naturally molting. This would have given them a sustainable collection of feathers throughout the year to create as many blankets as they wanted. This also explains the extreme reverence for turkeys still evident today in the Pueblo dances and rituals. In the 1200s, they used turkeys for everything. It wasn't until the 1600s that turkeys began to fall out of fashion. But before the Europeans arrived, turkeys were pretty much the only domesticated animal in North America. A terrible shipwreck. Researchers with the Alabama Historical Commission have authenticated and confirmed the discovery of the last known slave ship active in the United States. Over 150 years ago, the Clotilda was bringing slaves ripped from their homeland in Benin, West Africa, to Alabama in the United States. Even after the United States of America banned the importation of slaves from Africa in the year 1808, demand continued to boom. The cotton trade was in full swing, and Alabama plantation owners weren't interested in obeying the law. They wanted slave labor to work their plantations no matter what the cost. In 1860, way after slavery importation had been outlawed, the Clotilda sailed from Mobile to what was then the Kingdom of Dahomey. Captain William Foster was in charge of the mission. He brought back a group of Africans that had been captured by a warring tribe. Captain Foster snuck the ship into Mobile Bay at night and up the river. He kept some slaves for himself and handed the rest over to a plantation owner. To get rid of the evidence, Captain Foster had the Clotilda moved upstream, burned, and sunk to the bottom of the river. After the Civil War in 1865, the Clotilda survivors tried to return to Africa but couldn't afford it, so they created a new town called Africatown. Their descendants grew up hearing about the ship and their homeland and wanted to prove the stories were true. Several organizations, including Search Inc. and the Smithsonian, came together to send archaeologists and divers to look for the ship for years. As the Smithsonian curator said, it's not just a search for a ship, but a search to find the history and identity of all the people who were brought against their will. Finally, after several decades, the ship was finally discovered at the bottom of the Mobile River. The Terrifying Aztec God. If you lived in ancient Mesoamerica, regardless of if you belonged to the Toltec culture or the Aztecs, there was one thing that scared you senseless. His name was Tezcatlipoca, and he was one of the most important gods from what is now Mexico all the way into Central America. He was considered invisible, omnipotent, and was the favorite god of warriors. However, he was also seen as the bringer of both good and evil. It's a little confusing, but he was particularly important for Mesoamerican cultures and was the embodiment of change through conflict, usually arguments and war. For the Aztecs, Tezcatlipoca was the supreme god of all gods and very closely associated with death. But unlike gods from other cultures like the Greeks, who sat in their castles or on top of their mountains, the Mesoamerican gods were often considered ever-present. Tezcatlipoca was always aware at every place and always watching. People were afraid of him because they believed he could interfere with their affairs. When Tezcatlipoca felt like it, he could bring people utter misery. But he wasn't necessarily all evil. In Aztec mythology, he was a vengeful god who often punished evil behavior being done in the earthly realm. Mr. T had many mythical adventures, including the creation of the first dogs. It all goes back to the flood that destroyed the world. There were 2 survivors who decided to cook fish, but the smoke irritated the gods so much that they complained to T. To make them happy, he cut off their heads and reattached them to their backsides, creating dogs. A bit of an overreaction, but back in the day, there was no time for nonsense. Tezcatlipoca was worshipped in special ceremonies where a handsome and brave warrior from another tribe would be captured and sacrificed with an obsidian knife. Only the best would do, and if not, Mr. T would come down and rain terror amongst the people. Solar eclipses. Thousands of years ago, people were utterly terrified of solar eclipses. The first documented solar eclipse happened about 5,000 years ago. The moon passed between the Earth and the Sun, and there was total darkness. The ancient people did not like this at all. You have to remember, primitive people were obsessed with astrology. The changing of the seasons, the comings of the solstices, it was all very important to their way of life. Astronomy and astrology were the same. Seeing the sun blocked out in the middle of the day, all of the light just draining out of the sky like that, it would have been seen as a huge disturbance in the natural order of things. Many people would have even believed it was the end of the world. The farther back we go, the more terrified the people would have been. The earliest cultures saw the sun and the moon as supernatural gods residing over them in the sky. Almost every story in every religion began with the sun and the moon, the stars twinkling in the night, and the cycling of the seasons. When the sun went black, things were seen as very, very wrong. It would have been like actually witnessing a god above get snuffed out of existence. Even if it was only for a few seconds, it really scared people. As time went on, culture started to realize eclipses were just things that sometimes happened. To make sense of it, almost all ancient cultures resorted to a very similar story. From the Vietnamese to the Scandinavian Vikings, they told tales of a great beast eating the sun to explain the eclipse. In Vietnam, it was a frog that ate the sun. There was a mountain lion in the Andes of South America. And in Norse culture, it was the giant wolves Skoll and Hati, the Egyptian devourer of the dead. Amit was one of the most frightening creatures the ancient Egyptians wholeheartedly believed in. He had the head of a crocodile, the torso of a leopard, and the lower body of a hippopotamus. We all know the Egyptians were fascinated with hybrid creatures, and Amit really captured the best of that obsession. He wasn't as peaceful as the Sphinx, not as lordly as Anubis with his dog head and human body. No, Amit was terrifying. But he was terrifying for a reason. Amit's job was to punish wicked people in the afterlife. When a person in ancient Egypt died, their spirit went to the next world. Their first stop was in the Hall of Ma'at. Here they would undergo the judgment of Osiris, in which their heart was placed on the scale of truth and weighed against one of the feathers of Ma'at. If the heart was lighter than the feather, they would be brought to eternal paradise. If the heart was heavier, Amit stepped in. Assuming the heart was heavy, this particular person was not good enough in their life to be welcomed into the afterlife. But they wouldn't be sent to hell or some other awful place either. Instead, Amit would literally devour their soul. The soul would then be gone forever, ripped apart by the jaws of Amit. Comets. For the people of the ancient world, comets were yet another terrifying phenomenon to witness in the sky. Comets were almost always harbingers of doom. According to historian Duane Koenig, ancient people saw comets as warnings of dire evil. They were only very occasionally seen as harbingers of happy things, foreshadowing the birth of a prophet or a king. But these were few and far between, so comets were regarded so severely that some civilizations, like the early Persians and Koreans, would formally declare war with whichever country the comet's tail was pointing toward. If you think reasons for going to war in the modern age are ridiculous, just try being in Persia during a meteor shower. Pliny the Elder, the most famous historian from Rome, wrote extensively about comets. He believed a comet only appeared during certain times when things were going terribly wrong. For example, he claimed there was a comet in the sky the day Nero succeeded Claudius as the emperor of Rome. Then there were apparently comets all throughout Nero's rule until he was finally gone. It didn't stop with the Romans. In 1066, the famous Battle of Hastings was preceded by Halley's Comet streaking across the sky. It turned out to be the end of the Anglo-Saxon king. In 1528, there was a comet the color of blood that apparently made people sick during the Reformation. It wasn't until 1608, when the telescope was invented, that people finally realized comets are actually just pieces of rock in space. Although that didn't stop mass panic in 1910, when Halley's Comet appeared and perfectly modern people hid inside wells and caves. Are you afraid of comets? Let me know in the comments below. Snakes and spiders. There is one fear that seems to be greater than anything, and it's one we still share today with our oldest ancestors. Anyone who has ever seen a snake, a spider, or a scaly reptile and shrieked in horror knows what I'm talking about. We have been scared of snakes and spiders, as well as other creepy crawly things, since we had brains. If you've ever wondered why, it all goes back to evolution. According to National Geographic, the earliest brains of our ancestors had to be effective at identifying threats, specifically reptile threats. Way before humans were the modern version of humans we are today, while we were still evolving from our earlier and more primitive ancestors, the environment was totally dominated by reptiles. And because reptiles were a lot bigger before, and a lot meaner, early humans made quick meals for giant snakes and lizards. All these years later, we are still afraid of snakes, spiders, and other scary animals that might bite us. It's not that we think these things are ugly, but it's hardwired into our brains. On a scale of 1 to 10, how afraid are you of snakes and spiders and creepy crawly things? Let me know in the comments. Volcanoes. The Vikings were terrified of volcanoes. You can't really blame them, but still, they hated them. To make matters worse for the Vikings, they were always settling on new islands that happened to have volcanoes on them. Quite often, they would arrive someplace, start exploring, and then the ground would shake. The nearby mountain would rumble, and smoke and fire would start spitting from its top. Naturally, they came to associate volcanoes with death and destruction. After all, there was no scientific way to explain a mountain exploding back in the day. The one thing that made sense to the Vikings was that it all had to do with the end of the world. In the year 934, just shortly after the Vikings arrived in Iceland, a volcanic eruption occurred. It was one of the biggest volcanic eruptions in the history of humankind. The Vikings who witnessed it had no clue what was happening. To them, the exploding mountain was the beginning of Ragnarok, the end of all things. These poor guys had just traveled to the island, just started building their settlement, and suddenly Ragnarok was filling the sky with ash and fire. What do you think would be the scariest natural phenomenon to witness if you'd never heard about it before? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Small groupings of holes. Modern people are just as scared of snakes as people from 10,000 years ago. But here's something even stranger than that. Modern people have an unpleasant reaction to small clusters of holes. Our ancestors were straight up terrified of them. Think of a honeycomb, soap bubbles, or aerated chocolate bubbles. You can even think of a lotus flower with clustered holes. Looking at these things gives humans a subtle sense of unease. We're not exactly terrified, at least not these days, but we still get uncomfortable. Scientists have known about this for a long time, but only recently figured out why. The actual name for the fear is called trypophobia, and it's a result of millions of years of evolution. Around 16% of people have severe reactions to small clusters of holes, while many more people only have subtle reactions. Geoff Cole from the University of Essex called it the most common phobia that nobody has ever heard of. Do you have it? Hopefully this isn't too uncomfortable for you. It goes back to our ancestors who learned how to identify poisonous animals in the wild. If you look at a blue-ringed octopus, a deathstalker scorpion, any of the dozens of poisonous spiders, and even the king cobra snake, you will see they all have one thing in common. They have bright patterns of spots that look similar to small clusters of holes. Our brains make the association between the holes on a lotus flower and the spots of a cobra, and it creates a fear response. We know today not to be scared, so most people don't scream at the sight of holes. But ancient people had a much harder time dealing with it. What do you think? Does this make sense? Let me know in the comments. Diseases. According to many historians, religion throughout the centuries has been based on fear. Specifically, many religious deities from different cultures stemmed out of the fear of something. Snake gods because of the human fear of snakes, war deities because of a general terror of war, and death gods because people really were afraid of dying. What ancient people were also afraid of was getting a disease and suffering a sickness. When the first plague struck in the 6th century, the Justinian plague, people thought it was caused by angry gods seeking to punish humanity. It helped explain all the bad things that were happening in the world. Hariti is the Buddhist goddess whose specific job it is to ward off smallpox. Statues of Hariti have been excavated all throughout India since around the 5th century BC. This was when the first smallpox outbreaks started to occur globally. As soon as children started being affected by smallpox, ancient Buddhists began worshipping a goddess they made up out of thin air. It goes to show just how horrified people were of getting sick, so much that they made up their own gods to protect them from disease. Demons in Mesopotamia. The ancient Mesopotamians were absolutely terrified of demons. They lived in constant fear that their lives would be corrupted and destroyed by an evil spirit. For the Mesopotamians, demons came in all shapes and sizes. A demon could be the wind itself. It could come in the form of a thunderstorm, or it could represent an illness ravaging the body. Because people didn't understand natural forces, they attributed basically everything to demons. But demon mania really started to take off during the reign of the Assyrians in 934. It was around this time when people started to wear protective amulets wherever they went. They would hang these amulets around their necks and even put extras on the walls of their home to protect them from being invaded by demons. The amulets fought fire with fire, as they often displayed images of the fearsome demon named Pazuzu. To the Assyrians, Pazuzu was the most terrible wind demon of all. He had a head like a dog, a slim human body, clawed hands, eagle wings, and the tail of a scorpion. He was so awful that the Assyrians believed he would protect them from other demons infiltrating their houses. Demons like Lamashtu, who was known to hurt pregnant women and take away their babies. She had donkey ears, stringy hair, and talons for feet. When a pregnant woman began to suffer from some unknown medical issue, the Assyrians would bring in an exorcist to banish the demon Lamashtu that had surely snuck into the woman's body. Hades and the underworld. Hades in Greek mythology was the brother of Zeus and Poseidon. Zeus ruled over the earth, Poseidon ruled over the sea, and Hades ruled the underworld. But unlike the other gods, there aren't actually that many written accounts of Hades. The Greeks kind of stayed away from him, not even wanting to depict him in their ancient artwork. They barely created any temples to Hades. He wasn't worshipped by most common people, and many wouldn't even say his name out loud. It's because the ancient Greeks were scared of him. The Greeks believed the underworld was a particularly cruel place. It was filled with awful monsters, giants with hundreds of hands, dogs with too many heads, and Hades presiding over it all. Sure, the Elysian Fields was a paradise within the underworld, but this was only for heroic figures. Most other people ended up in the fields of the Asphodel, a very uninteresting limbo where people shambled around as wisps for eternity. Unlike the Christian view of heaven and hell, there were 3 places to go for the Greeks. If you were a hero, you went to paradise. If you were an average person, you went to the gray land of neutrality forever. But then there's the 3rd place, reserved for people who were truly bad. This place was called Tartarus, and it was where Hades devised the most evil methods of torture imaginable. The Greeks were greatly fearful of ending up in Tartarus. They were so scared of it, and the god that ruled over it, that they tried their best not to mention either of them. Thanks for watching! What things were ancient people afraid of that you would be afraid of too? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. We've got lots more videos coming up. See you next time. Bye!